Hello and welcome to PT and Nutrition Education's e-learning platform. Today we will be focusing on preparation for the examination in nutrition. One thing that I want you to consider is that whilst we will be preparing you for your examination, we will be going beyond the scope of some of the topic areas just because we feel that it will better prepare you as a personal trainer in supporting your clients as you go forward in your career. The first question I always ask with regards to protein, the macronutrient, is the role which it plays within the human body. So have a little think, maybe jot that down, and we will reveal all in the next slide. Okay, no doubt you were thinking along the lines of growth and repair when it comes to protein, and I just want you to understand that you are correct. However, maybe to broaden your horizons with regards to how important protein actually is. So as you can see from the list there, protein is the building block of life, okay? And there's a fantastic quote saying there that everything we do, everything we are, and everything that we become depends on the action of protein. Pretty much every cell within your body is either a protein itself or is influenced by the action of proteins. And without exhausting the list, you can see some of the roles and functions that protein plays, such as immunity, hormone production, okay, and even biochemical reaction, which enables you to produce energy in the form of ATP. Now, protein is different from carbohydrate and fat in that it has a nitrogen group attached to it, okay? So as you can see from this diagram here, all right, we have a carbon backbone, we have some hydrogen attached to it, just like a carbohydrate and just like a fat. However, the difference here is that there is a nitrogen group. Now, your body cannot process nitrogen, so in order to be able to use that protein, we have to remove that nitrogen, okay? Very early studies on protein, in fact, looked at what's called your nitrogen balance in order to determine whether you had a high or low protein diet. So let's delve deeper into protein, and in particular we're going to talk about food examples of protein. But before that, we need to understand the smallest components of protein, which are known as amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of life, and in total we have 20 amino acids. Okay, now these can be split into two different categories. We have what's known as a non-essential amino acid, meaning that the body can naturally create these, and an essential amino acid, which means that we have to derive these from our diet. Okay, so it's sometimes contested with regards to how many non-essential versus essential amino acids there are, and this does depend on the textbook which you read. Okay, in total there are either 8 or 9 essential amino acids, and there are 11 or 12 non-essential amino acids. All right. Now the confusion lies with this amino acid, and it's known as histidine. So the most recent textbooks now have started to identify histidine as an essential amino acid, meaning that we have to derive this from our diet. Okay. So for the purpose of your examination, please understand there are 9 essential amino acids and there are 11 non-essential amino acids. Now, let's talk about food examples and how the amino acid profile of a food that we ingest will determine the type of protein that we are eating. So we have two types, as you can see here. We have what's known as an incomplete protein and a complete protein. Now, a complete protein contains all of the 9 essential amino acids. And as you can see from these food examples, generally we are talking about animal sources of protein which contain all of the essential amino acids. Incomplete proteins, however, do not contain all of the 9 essential amino acids. So generally there we are talking about primarily carbohydrate sources such as lentils or whole wheat pasta. They do contain protein, but they don't contain all of the 9 essential amino acids. So you may be asking the question, how might you support a client who is maybe averse to eating some of these complete proteins from animal sources? And the answer might lie within combining incomplete protein sources to make sure that the full spectrum of essential amino acids is met. The example that I like to use is beans on toast. Individually, those sources of protein are incomplete because they don't contain all of the 9 essential amino acids. However, combined in a meal means that all of the 9 essential amino acids are taken care of, and therefore we are eating a complete protein meal. The other thing that I want to speak about is protein as substrate. Now, substrate is just a fancy word for fuel. The body doesn't particularly like to use protein as a fuel. However, 1 gram of protein does contain around 4 kilocalories. Now, the reason why protein is not used as a fuel is referring to what we spoke about on the previous slide, in that a amino acid contains a nitrogen group. Okay, so we have to get rid of that nitrogen group before we use protein as a fuel. Around 2 to 5% of the protein that you ingest will actually be oxidized in the mitochondria, right? But that's a very, very small percentage of the amount of protein that you ingest which will be used as fuel. There are circumstances when that can be increased, okay? And what we're referring to there is somebody that's on a very high protein diet, and naturally, because of the excess amino acids in the system, they will be oxidized and can be used as fuel. Or somebody that is in a very low energy availability state, such as fasted training, where the body may start to use protein, break that down and start to oxidize it for fuel. Okay, but as I said, the body doesn't necessarily like to use protein as a fuel. Okay, so by now you're probably wondering about protein metabolism. So when we ingest a protein-rich meal, what are the processes which occur, and how are those functions and roles divided with the amino acids which we have ingested? So of course, with every meal that we ingest, it is absorbed into the bloodstream. Those amino acids are broken down and taken to the liver, and then they will essentially be divided across the body in order to fulfill some of the roles which we spoke about on the first slide. Okay, so one thing that I want to draw your attention to here is that transport of those amino acids to our skeletal muscle only really accounts for 10 to 20% of the amount of protein that we ingest. This can either be myofibrillar protein synthesis, so this is the building of new skeletal muscle, or it can be mitochondrial protein synthesis, which is the building of the powerhouses within our cell, which allow us to aerobically respirate in order to produce energy. As we mentioned from the first slide, those amino acids go towards enzyme and also hormone production, making non-essential amino acids, which the body can do naturally, as we discussed on the previous slide. Transport of energy. So I did say that protein can be used as a fuel, although the body doesn't particularly like to do that because it has to work hard in order to be able to use it as a fuel. And the reason for that, if you remember, is the fact that we have to remove that nitrogen group from that amino acid. Okay, but in very extreme circumstances like starvation or fasted training with very low carbohydrate availability or energy availability, then we can break down those amino acids into keto acids, which you may have heard of before, and then we can actually use that energy as substrate. Substrate means fuel. And then lastly, a very interesting process is this process of gluconeogenesis. You can actually use amino acids in order to produce glucose. So in very low carbohydrate diets, for example, we can increase the amount of amino acids that we are using in order to produce glucose. So in fact, carbohydrate is actually the only non-essential macronutrient of the three. And the reason for that is because we could never eat a carbohydrate again, and our body has the ability to produce glucose molecules from other sources. One of those is protein. We'll talk more about that when we come to the carbohydrate lecture. Okay, and then lastly, once we have divided all of these roles and functions of amino acids around the body, then we may have some excess which we need to get rid of. Okay, so this can be as well in the form of nitrogen, and we get rid of this in the form of a process known as oxidative deamination. So in order to remove that nitrogen, we produce a substance called ammonia. This is then turned into urea, and then eventually we will excrete that through our urine. Now, contrary to popular belief, we cannot overconsume protein, which would cause a renal deficiency. The early studies which actually came up with that conclusion were from people who already had pre-existing kidney issues. So they were fed upward of 3 grams per kilogram of protein in relation to their body weight, and what that did was that further exacerbated their kidney problems. Since then, studies have been undertaken by Jose Antonio, I think a scientist from America, and they have fed healthy people with healthy kidneys upwards of 4 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein per day, and they saw no decrease in kidney function or kidney damage. So I think it's pretty safe that we can consume protein. The body will quite easily excrete that, provided we have no pre-existing kidney condition. Okay, so I want to shift gears a little bit with regards to dietary protein. We are still talking about the action of protein, but I want to get you guys to understand the power of nutrition. And I feel that this is really important for this lecture series on nutrition, that you can have a direct impact on not only your health, but also your performance based on your dietary intake. And I want you to understand the processes which your body goes through in order to determine what's known as the phenotype of our cells. So this is referring to the characteristics of your cells, how they perform, how they respond, and how they adapt based on the stimulus that you put on the body. And in this case, we're talking about exercise, and we're also talking about dietary intake. Now, of course, dietary intake can be from 3 macronutrient sources: protein, fat, and carbohydrate. But with this being the protein lecture, we're just going to focus on the action of protein. Now, we may have heard of the expression, "we are what we eat," and really what that's referring to is the quality of your dietary intake may determine a whole host of factors, and as we said before, our cell phenotype. So as you can see from this diagram here, based on our dietary intake of protein, fat, carbohydrates, polyphenols, pre and probiotics, fiber, the list goes on. And this can have an impact on the likes of our gut bacteria. So healthy gut bacteria has been shown to influence, for example, our brain in what's known as the gut-brain axis. So the efficiency of our brain can be altered by a positive dietary intake from high-quality sources, and therefore increasing the amount of gut bacteria, which might have a direct influence on our brain. Host diseases we've heard a lot about, such as cardiovascular disease, obesity, metabolic syndrome. All of these can be better fought against with a high quality dietary intake. And then of course metabolism. So it may be we may be better prepared to maintain a healthy body composition with some high quality protein, fat and carbohydrate sources. On the flip side, we can also have an impact on the body's response based on the exercise stimulus that we do. So again, there are a whole host of adaptations that can occur based on the stimulus that you give the body, but we may get, for example, an improved metabolism and ability to burn carbohydrate and fat as fuel. Okay, we may get a better ability for our skeletal muscle to use oxygen. Our central nervous system may work more efficiently in terms of blood flow around the brain, and therefore the advantages that come with that. The point that we are making here is that there are direct influences based on the stimulus that we put on the body, and that we can better improve those adaptations through high quality nutrition and high quality exercise. And hopefully, as this lecture series progresses, you will really start to see the power of dietary intake and how protein, fat and carbohydrate really can modulate the impact of an exercise training session. This ultimately means that you're going to be better prepared to serve your client and help them achieve the goals that they want to achieve. Some people may want improved body composition, some people may want improved muscle mass, and of course there are certain things that you can do in terms of your dietary intake, but also the exercise stimulus which can bring about those responses. And again, this influences the phenotype of our cells. So just to put this into context, if we look at two divergent exercise training sessions, one in the form of resistance training and one in the form of cardiovascular training, you can see that there is a huge difference in some of the biological impacts of those exercise training sessions. All of these proteins and these gene expressions here, we don't need to understand them, but just know that when we resistance train, then we set off this domino effect of protein translation and protein transcription, which can bring about increased muscle hypertrophy. On the flip side, by going out and doing some cardiovascular exercise, then we can change the amount of substrate in a skeletal muscle, okay, which then impacts certain proteins within that muscle, which again sets off a domino effect, which can ultimately end in more mitochondrial biogenesis. And mitochondrial biogenesis is essentially just the growth of more of our power stations, which essentially means we get aerobically fitter. So this is really just to show you that if we take part in certain exercise training sessions, it may bring about a certain adaptation in those cells. I'm keen to just hit this point home, but with regards to that adaptation, of course we have two ends of the scale. As you can see from the picture behind, we have a power and strength athlete in Chris Hoy, and then we have an endurance athlete in Chris Froome. So when we do a certain exercise stimulus, then we bring about a certain adaptive response. Skeletal muscle, as you can see here, is a highly malleable, in sports science it's known as a plastic tissue, because it can be molded to suit the needs of the individual based on the stimulus that you give it. Now, when we do some strength training, it is generally high intensity. There is mechanical stress in the form of resistance training, and from this stimulus we get increases in contractile force, increases in skeletal muscle hypertrophy, specifically the myofibrils, which are the muscle fibers, the contractile units which allow us to move a muscle, and then also we get an increase in higher threshold motor unit recruitment. So this is a neural response where the brain basically wakes up more muscle fibers in order for them to fire and to produce more force. Now on the flip side, somebody that's doing endurance exercise, what they get is an increase in aerobic capacity. Their ability to use oxygen during exercise increases. Now with that, there is what's known as substrate alterations. Now a substrate is fuel, okay, and when we become a superior endurance athlete, then there is a propensity to burn more fat at higher exercise intensities. What this means is that we can therefore spare carbohydrate for when the more challenging parts of competition are forced upon us. And then one that we've spoken about on the previous slide, mitochondrial biogenesis. So this is basically the increase in the amount of mitochondria that we have within our skeletal muscle. So our skeletal muscle essentially becomes more dense with mitochondria. More mitochondria means more energy output, meaning better endurance performance. Now, the reason why I'm heading this point home is because the principles of training which you enforce on an individual, such as the frequency, intensity, the time, the type, the duration, the tempo, all of these variables can be played with to bring about a certain adaptive response. Now, you might be asking, what has this got to do with protein and what has this got to do with nutrition? And my point being is that I'm keen to just hit this point home, but with regards to that adaptation, of course, we have two ends of the scale. As you can see from the picture behind, we have a power and strength athlete in Chris Hoy, and then we have an endurance athlete in Chris Froome. So when we do a certain exercise stimulus, then we bring about a certain adaptive response. Skeletal muscle, as you can see here, is a highly malleable, in sports science it's known as a plastic tissue, because it can be molded to suit the needs of the individual based on the stimulus that you give it. Now, when we do some strength training, it is generally high intensity. There is mechanical stress in the form of resistance training, and from this stimulus we get increases in contractile force, increases in skeletal muscle hypertrophy, specifically the myofibrils, which are the muscle fibers, the contractile units which allow us to move a muscle, and then also we get an increase in higher threshold motor unit recruitment. So this is a neural response where the brain basically wakes up more muscle fibers in order for them to fire and to produce more force. Now, on the flip side, somebody that's doing endurance exercise, what they get is an increase in aerobic capacity. Their ability to use oxygen during exercise increases. Now, with that, there is what's known as substrate alterations. Now, a substrate is fuel, okay? And when we become a superior endurance athlete, then there is a propensity to burn more fat at higher exercise intensities. What this means is that we can therefore spare carbohydrate for when the more challenging parts of competition are forced upon us. And then one that we've spoken about on the previous slide, mitochondrial biogenesis. So this is basically the increase in the amount of mitochondria that we have within our skeletal muscle. So our skeletal muscle essentially becomes more dense with mitochondria. More mitochondria means more energy output, meaning better endurance performance. Now, the reason why I'm heading this point home is because the principles of training which you enforce on an individual, such as the frequency, intensity, the time, the type, the duration, the tempo, all of these variables can be played with to bring about a certain adaptive response. Now, you might be asking, what has this got to do with protein and what has this got to do with nutrition? And my point being is that if we were to change principles of training to principles of nutrition, and we were to look at some of the variables that we can play with when it comes to designing a nutrition program, then what we might be able to do is better support our client in achieving whatever goal they may have. So this could be the frequency of eating, how many times we're eating per day and why we are doing that. The timing, so how close do we eat after an exercise training session and why. The type of carbohydrate, protein or fat that we may ingest. The total amount of the macronutrient or calories that we can consume. And then the quality of the nutrition. What makes a good quality source of protein, for example. So what we're going to do over this lecture series is we're going to start to look at some research which relates to some of these variables with regards to nutrition, and hopefully this will give you more tools in your toolbox and using the right tool at the right time for the betterment of your client program. So hopefully what's been clear over the last couple of slides is really setting the scene with regards to adaptation, and also how you, the personal trainer, can play with the principles of training, play with the principles of nutrition, and really, you are in control of some of the adaptive responses that can occur based on you implementing the right variable at the right time for the right reason. Okay, so let's bring the 2 points together now with regards to gene expression, which we've just been speaking about, and also protein ingestion in the form of amino acids. How is it that these two worlds collide, and therefore how can we use this information to bring about a better nutritional intervention for a client? So, the first concept which I want you to understand is a process known as protein transcription, okay? Now, this occurs within the nucleus of a cell. So if we are talking about skeletal muscle, within that nucleus of the cell within skeletal muscle, then of course we contain this DNA, okay? Now, DNA is essentially just made up of a plethora of gene sequences, and our genes, which is a segment of the DNA, is essentially an amino acid sequence, which we know from previous slides is a protein peptide. So when I increase my resistance training stimulus, for example, then what I do is I innovate a gene within my DNA which is coded for resistance training, okay? So when that gene has been woken up, if you like, or expressed, then what will happen is that will cause a domino effect, and the increase in the gene expression of that particular part of the gene, or the DNA, which is in this case resistance training, then we get what's called a genetic copy in the form of an mRNA. So basically we just copy and then we paste the genetic code. What happens now is that we then need to paste that code into what's known as protein translation. So within your cell we have something what's known as a ribosome, and this is where new proteins are made. So if we've eaten a protein-rich meal after a resistance training program, or session should I say, then what would happen is these amino acids that we've ingested, which hopefully will be essential and complete, will ensure that we provide the necessary framework for that gene for resistance training to be copied and copied and copied. Now, if we do this again and again and again over the course of, let's say, 12 weeks, then the net effect will be skeletal muscle hypertrophy. We have to express the gene through the stimulus of resistance training, and then we have to provide the building blocks, the amino acids, for which that skeletal muscle hypertrophy can take place. Okay, so that's it for the protein lecture part 1. If you pop over now to protein part 2, we're going to start to delve into skeletal muscle hypertrophy, and also some studies which surround the timing, type and total amount of protein that you can consume in order to maximize muscle protein synthetic responses.